We're delighted today not only to do this on behalf of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, but in tandem with Wellington Advocacy. And I'll introduce my colleague in just a second. I think many of the folks here in the audience recognize me, but just a quick introduction. My name is Jonathan Berkshire Miller, and I'm Director of the Foreign Affairs, National Security, and National Defense Program here at Macdonald-Laurier Institute. So before I get into some of the topic, we're going to have a great panel here afterwards. I'd like to do a little bit of the housekeeping notes just so that you don't run off and scurry off after the discussion. So we will start with some opening remarks from my colleague here, Idee. Then we will get into a panel with the great panel, all-star panel that we have here set up, which I'll introduce later. You will have a chance as the audience to ask questions as well, so we'll have about 30 minutes of audience questions. And then finally, we won't lead you in a caloric deficit, and we will give you some food afterwards, so don't scurry off. It's a chance, if you already haven't done your networking before this discussion, to stick around here at Kildare House and have some snacks. So with that being said, Idee, I'm going to introduce you, and as I said before, we're really grateful for this partnership. I think the timing is great. We understand that you just came back from New York, from the United Nations General Assembly meetings on the sidelines there, so this is a perfect person that you have to give the framing remarks, thinking about how Canada is engaging with the world, the different alignments that are happening. Idee, I did warn you that I will be very brief with your bio. Take my word for it, he is known in Ottawa. I think most people know him here that focus on international relations issues. He previously served as Director of Policy and Stakeholder Relations for the Office of the Minister of International Development, and was twice recognized. I don't have even one recognition on this, so I'm impressed, as the top 100 influencing the Government of Canada's foreign policy. So, ladies and gentlemen, you are very lucky to have Idee here from Wellington Advocacy. Idee, please.
Good morning, everyone, and again, thanks for those comments, Jonathan. You've built this as me framing the discussion. I think that's a little bit, ambitious. I just want to take this opportunity to, explain a little bit about why we at Wellington Advocacy are partnering with you on this journey. So a little bit about Wellington Advocacy. We are a national public affairs firm working in crisis communications, government relations, as well as international development. And in the course of our work, we have this knowledge building exercise, and we noticed that international development, international cooperation is hardly mentioned in foreign policy. And so we wanted to partner with you and MLI to continue to bring these thoughts on how we can be more effective in our international cooperation, how the tools of international development can be more effectively deployed in Canada for both our Canadian interests, but as well as achieving the goals of international development. And that's really the crux of the discussion this morning here with yourselves. You've mentioned that I just came back from the UN, and on the margins of the UNGA summit and UNGA meetings, one of the observations I've had across this last week has been the kind of frank discussion for the first time in a long time at the UN on how, we may not be meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. There's this thing we're 7 years in, halfway through the Sustainable Development Goals, only about 15% of the targets are on track, to be met out of 200 and something targets. So I think it's time to have a sober reflection on what it is that we need to do, who are the partners, right? And given the geopolitical shifts that are happening, are these institutions, are these formulations the right formulations, and how does Canada play in that regard to continue to use its current stature, its alliances to advance those goals? So I look forward myself to this, very illustrious panel. And I was telling Jonathan before we got here, I now understand why people partner with you guys in doing things, because when we talked about having this panel, I thought, who was going to come listen to anybody at 10 o'clock on Friday morning? But given what has happened this week, some kinds of announcement on Monday and then book ending with a presidential visit, on Friday, I'm happy we did it with you guys. So thank you so much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Idee. Thank you so much for the partnership, and thank you also for not having to be on the panel and deal with all of these complicated questions that we have our dream panel here to deal with. So, in line with what I said to Idee, we have distinguished panelists here. Many of them are familiar faces here at MLI. We will not go through line by line your distinguished CVs, but I will quickly go, and Norbert, I'm going to give you the first chance to talk on this. Norbert Eschborn obviously is well known to many here in Ottawa and is a great long-term friend of MLI. He is now the director of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung office here in Canada, and not only that, but he opened this office here. So we're grateful for his long-term partnership, but I think a lot of Canadians are grateful that we now have a partner in Konrad-Adenauer. That is, how many years has it been now since your office?
4 and a little bit.
4 and a little bit. So we hope 40 comes along sooner than later. But also he has a lot of authority to speak on this issue because a lot of his prior postings, and as an Indo-Pacific hand myself, the fact that you've spent much of your career in different parts of Southeast Asia, South Asia as well, I think gives you a lot of fortitude for this discussion. So Norbert, if I can just start this discussion off with you, I think Idee had a lot of interesting framings there. Clearly he just came from the United Nations General Assembly, was talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. We look at the development piece, but I think we can't divorce that also from the diplomacy piece and the defense piece. I wonder from an outside perspective, even though you're half insider, half outsider, what your reflections are here on the different international shifts and alignments and where Canada sort of fits in on this. So Norbert, if I can give you the first go at this, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning, everybody. First of all, let me please thank you and friends and colleagues at MLI for this kind invitation. Normally, I belong to the listening guests here, and such events are an opportunity for me to learn and relax. And today, in this respect, I am looking forward to the change of perspectives. I have an audit in my office. I'm saying this because I have been spending my time this week chasing 50 cents here, $8 there, in order to make ends meet for the auditor, working a lot of additional hours, and I wrote my thoughts this morning, 5 a.m. So I ask for your understanding that I rely a little bit more on my paper for this introductory statement than I normally do. Rethinking international cooperation in the age of geopolitical competition is, in my view, a very important topic that is being taken up here at the right time. For some years now, we have been experiencing systemic conflict in many places in the world that are of geopolitical significance. The Konrad-Adenauer Foundation has been working very intensively on these system conflicts. When the Cold War ended, and we Germans experienced that firsthand, and the Soviet Union disintegrated, it was more than just the final chord of a power political conflict between West and East. It was also the end of a conflict between two different systems, two worldviews. The concept of liberal market democracies had prevailed over the utopia of communist world revolution. A period of optimism then set in, not least in the West. Now that the system antagonism had dissolved, democracy could begin its worldwide triumphal procession. That was the thinking of many at the time, myself included. Today, more than 30 years later, we know that many hopes have not been fulfilled. First of all, it must be noted that the growing conflict between the Western countries on the one hand and China, Russia, and a number of other states on the other actually also bears the hallmarks of a systemic conflict. We cannot close our eyes to the fact that China, even beyond its own totalitarian organization, is trying to relativize the international standards that have emerged since 1945 with regard to human rights or even the rule of law in favor of its own authoritarian standards. In other words, China today not only seeks a global redistribution of power within the existing system, but also wants to change the basic rules to our disadvantage. The rise of new great powers, meanwhile, has at all times created tensions in the international order. And it is plausible to assume that there would be friction between the Western states that have dominated the world in recent decades and an upstart like China, even regardless of differences in the political system. And we should be more open than in the past, both to the public at home and to the world outside, about the fact that our foreign policy does not always follow or can follow only moral considerations, but it also characterized by necessities, constraints, and our own interests. After all, many states outside the West have a keen sense of when we preach water but drink wine. The crucial question here is whether it makes sense to view current developments primarily through the lens of a systemic conflict between democracy and autocracy, and to carry this before us like a monstrance. We know from our research, from Latin America to South Asia to North Africa and the Middle East, none of the countries KS studied shows even the slightest inclination to fit into a block logic of any kind and to make abstract normative questions the guiding principle of their own foreign policy. What dominates across all continents is a pragmatic policy guided by concrete self-interest, in which far less is asked about fundamental principles than about what concretely can be achieved for one's own country in the respective situation. The fact that states avoid taking sides, either with the West or with their challenges, has different and in some cases historical reasons, and from the point of view of those states, it's entirely rational. On the other hand, no one wants to join the camp that might then lose the global conflict, which is why many actors simply want to wait and see who wins. On the other hand, those who do not commit themselves and are courted by both sides can drive up the price for their own favor. Even democracies are not automatically partners for the West on all issues in their foreign policy actions, and in some cases have significantly different perceptions and positions with regard to Russia, for example. This is true of Brazil, Mexico, and India, but also of NATO partner Turkey. But the reverse is also true. Even hardline autocracies are not necessarily close partners of China or Russia. What does this mean for our foreign policy? First, we will have to accept the soberly pragmatic, one might even say transactional approach of many states to a certain extent. This requires of us a realistic assessment and an openness to the perspectives, interests, and constraints on action of other countries, and the ability to contrast their interests with ours, to identify areas of overlap, and then to exploit them consistently. Our one intersection with many states lies in the defense of certain fundamental principles of the UN Charter, such as state sovereignty and territorial integrity. There we can forge alliances that reach beyond the group of Western states and even those of democratic states. Secondly, this means that we must be prepared to invest in relations with potential partner states in the long term, and not just on a crisis basis. In individual cases, responding to their interests may also require us to look beyond our own short-term economic benefits in trade or arms cooperation. For example, if this offers the prospect of binding the state in question closer to us politically in the medium term. And finally, we must recognize that there are no good dictators for us, since every dictatorship, by its nature, restricts human rights and runs counter to what we stand for, but that at the same time, it would be irrational to limit the circle of our potential foreign policy partners from the outset to democracies, let alone liberal democracies. There are quite a number of states in the world whose political and social systems do not correspond to our ideals, but which, unlike Russia and increasingly China, do not see themselves to behave as our allies. While a pragmatic approach will not immediately declare these states friends, it is open to cooperation on issues where there are common interests, thus helping to prevent the global balance of power from tipping in favor of China and Russia, and ultimately doing better service to our values. There is global systemic conflict. In order to survive it, we should always keep in mind, but not constantly mention it to third parties. We should focus more on pragmatic action and less on outward posturing and high-profile declarations, which are often armed primarily at the inclined domestic audience. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Norbert. I should note, by no means a reflection of your remarks, but just for everyone speaking as well, that everyone's speaking in a personal capacity. So I'm sure that your organization 100% agrees with you, but just to note that everyone here is not speaking on behalf of any organization. But Norbert, that was great framing remarks in so many ways, and I think the take-homes for a Canadian audience, I think, are profound. A couple of takeaways, and I think this will really kickstart our discussion, and Renée, I'm going to come to you next. The discussion of, I'm not sure if you mentioned in your remarks, but the Global South, or the framing of the Global South, which I think many would probably agree is an insufficient and potentially even a condescending sort of frame that we've put on a large group of countries. I reflect on a panel that I was in earlier this year in Europe, talking in the wake of Russia's war in Ukraine about the Global South and how the Global South was reacting to this. I mean, effectively, you're dealing with, as you mentioned, the muddiness of international affairs, where you have 140, 150 different states, perhaps with different histories, different languages, different interests. And I think that's the arena that we have to accept that we're engaging in. I think it's fundamentally challenging sometimes for the Canadian side, as we've talked about in the Institute several times, as we feel we're almost tethered to an IV drip of multilateralism, where that is the main form of diplomacy that we're used to, that we're comfortable with. But the reality is, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in South Asia and other places, that it is more muddied, that we have to do things somewhat minilaterally, multilaterally, ad hoc, transactional, strategic. It's all in the same. So I did want to return back to that afterwards. But Renée, I want to move over to you. And I think one of the interesting things that came out of Norbert's remarks, I mean, he talked about, I think, the development piece, which is very important. I see development, diplomacy, and defense all involved in this discussion at the same time. Renée obviously has, for those who don't know her, has a great background. She has served as a senior policy advisor to 3 different ministers of defense, and has survived, and is still willing to tell stories, which we're happy about.
I'm a glutton for punishment, I think.
And is now a senior fellow here at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, and in addition to many other titles. So Renée, happy for your initial thoughts on this, and then we'll move over to Balkan.
Yeah, I think, well, first, thank you for having me. It's always a privilege to sit up here with you and Balkan and Dr. Eschborn. I couldn't agree more that all 3 have to be involved. As a matter of fact, I'm very comfortable sitting next to Dr. Eschborn because I actually grew up in Germany on NATO bases there, and he mentioned the Cold War, and that was Canada's last, foray into confronting the great power competition that we're talking about today. And I can tell you that, having spent 6 years there, that my quality of life would go up and down, directly correlated with which government was in power. And not necessarily from a partisan side, but whether or not that government was providing defense spending. And it, more than just reminiscing and my soft spot for Lahr and Baden-Sollingen in Germany, aside, it points to the very critical need for predictable spending and persistent spending when it comes to national defense. The DM and the CDS a few weeks ago sent out a message to national defense talking about the cost-cutting exercise that's being undertaken. And they took the tack that we've seen before, which is that operational spending is not going to be cut, and that this is going to be a difficult exercise, but it must be done. Many people in this room have been through that exercise in the past. You know, whenever there's cost cutting at national defense, it basically means that less people are going to do more. And you know, in addition to that, we also have a recruitment and retention issue, which means even, you know, we're already starting with less people than we need. So very quickly, it does become somewhat operational. The commander of the Navy recently said publicly that he feels confident that he has what he needs to execute the Indo-Pacific strategy as it relates to the Navy, both on the you know, personnel side, but also on from the perspective of ships. We should watch that really closely. And I think the canary in the coal mine as it relates to defense spending is always quality of life. It's always what, you know, I experienced years ago during the Cold War, that suddenly there's no dental hygienist on the base. You know, things like that are kind of an indicator that tough times are coming. So we should watch that very closely, because defense and spending and predictable funding is critically important whenever we're talking about our place in the world, but specifically when we're talking about, especially when we're talking about great power dynamics. And the second thing I would mention, you know, is development. Because as you say, all three, diplomacy, development, defense, have to be implicated. And Canada has, over the course of many, many years, through the course of different administrations, have called it different things. You know, the 3D approach, development, diplomacy, defense, the whole of government approach that we executed in Afghanistan with, you know, with various agencies and all three involved again. And again, it necessarily has to happen as we look at the world from this great power competition dynamic. You know, we hear, what was the percentage that you gave on development targets? 15%. 15.
Of the targets that are out of 200 something targets are.
And that's, and this is probably the first time many people in this room have heard that. You know, and we are switched on. I mean, this is a switched on group that pays attention to these things. Development continuously gets short shrift when it comes to public discussion, and you know, and again, from a funding perspective, there's some concerns that there was no increase in development spending in the last budget. And here's why it's important in this case. I mean, we might be absorbing CETA into GAC and not spending money to reach our targets, at least in the near past with the last budget. But China certainly is. I mean, it's not a coincidence that they have carved out an agency from the Ministry of Defense specifically to focus on development. In fact, and I could get the translation wrong, but it even has the same acronym. Like, we used to have the CETA, you know, we used to have the Canadian International Development Agency, CETA. They've called it CETA as in the China International Development Agency. I mean, they're getting more powerful, and we're getting less powerful when it comes to being strategic when it comes to development. And we all know what that looks like when it comes to China. It looks like state clients developing state clients, and it looks like debt traps. And it's one thing to say it and see the Belt and Road Initiative and sort of the directions it goes in. It's a different thing to actually see it. And I know a lot of people in this room have seen it with their own eyes, but I remember going on a fact-finding mission with the Minister of Defense in 2017, and it was related to our peace support mission that we were going to participate in. And we went to 5 or 6 different countries in Africa, starting, you know, sort of with Tanzania, you know, Congo. And every single place we went, China, 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 China. Everything from, cell phone storefronts to infrastructure. And that sort of strategic depth, and I wouldn't necessarily call it strategic as it relates to sustainability. I mean, it's basically tied aid from China that you have to have not support Taiwan, and otherwise, all construction companies in China receive the contract work. So it's not necessarily, obviously it's not sustainable development. And Canada, on our end, we've learned the hard way, especially in Afghanistan, that local is critically important. So in a way, it's not even being done in a way that benefits the host country, but that is not nearly not the intention that they hope to execute. So their intention is clear, and it's in some cases access. The one thing I would add onto that is that there's been a proliferation of defense attachés and civ-pol missions. Now, civilian police training missions is something that Canada has done in the past. We don't have high numbers of civ-pol mission training around the world, but China certainly has, and they have proliferated. Civ-pol missions in some of these countries is clearly about access. So a lot of the things that we do well, and for the right reasons, they are doing for very strategic reasons, which is why to encounter it, we have to be more strategic about development spending. We do, as you, both of you have said earlier, tend to focus on the value over interest. When you don't back that up with funding, you're basically lecturing your partners. So I think we have to be a little bit less naive about using our development spending. It is really critically important to be strategic about it. It's typically been CETA and now development within GAC has typically been a junior minister that's gone there, sometimes a broken minister that's sustained some political damage, and is fairly weak around the cabinet table. And that does a real disservice to the development officers that I've seen in action in Afghanistan and elsewhere. But greater than that, it's a real disservice to how strategic we should be being about these things. I'm optimistic about the new minister, there's been a little bit more discussion about how strategic we need to be. The final thing I would say is that the great power competition, geopolitics, much like in the Cold War, I think is increasingly going to be the lens with which everything is viewed. And we saw that obviously this week with some saying that's the reason for the restrained response from the announcement that was made in the House by the Prime Minister. I'll end on this because I know it's going to come up, but Chrystia Freeland was on Power and Politics yesterday or the day before, and the host, David Cochran, asked her, about that, the restrained response, asked about geopolitics and a great power dynamic and the concern over being a counterpoint to China. And she perfunctorily said, this is not about geopolitics. Now that is not, in my view, surprising for her to say, because I think to some degree she has to say that. But I believe there's no question that the geopolitical lens on that issue is a factor, and one that we should be smart about. With that, I think...
Yes, thanks so much, Renée. I mean, those are great thoughts. I mean, Balkan, I'll hand it over to you in a second, but so many different areas of interest. I mean, thank you for bringing up defense and your experience there and some of your insights on that. But in particular, your discussion on development, I think, was really interesting. And a couple of things that I think in Canada, we're a little bit slower to adapt to. The first of all is the evolution of development more broadly. So many states, and we're not the only one guilty of this in the West, are still stuck on this mentality of ODA, so Overseas Development Assistance, the idea of being the donor country, when really we're getting into private-public partnerships. I mean, we should be looking at some of the countries that we're providing development assistance to as partners. Yes, their economies are not developed in certain sectors nearly as much as many of the countries in the West. But the idea, I think, not only is there a condescending element of it, but also in order to truly enable their economies and some of their sectors, I think we need that element of partnership. And we do see a lot of our allies actually moving in this direction. So one I'll point out, and I don't know if we have any representatives here in the room, but is Japan, who's been doing this for several years. One example would be their TCAD process in Africa, so their Tokyo Conference on International Development. They've evolved from a large ODA provider to actually nurturing private-public partnerships. We also have examples of working to build infrastructure in the region. India's done a great job of this in Africa as one example. We see it with some of the Quad countries as well. US, Australia, and Japan have a new infrastructure program happening in the region. So I think there's a lot of different dynamics on development that we should be looking at and not looking at everything again through the multilateral lens. The second thing I would say and why this is important is when you have those multilateral groupings, you can actually avoid the duplication. So you may be surprised how often duplication actually happens, where you're providing some assistance in a country and then you talk to either the Australians or the Kiwis or the Japanese, and you're like, what are you doing there? And you're like, well, you're doing the same thing that we're doing. Please don't tell anyone. So that's redundant. That's not worth our time. And then a last theme I'll leave you with that often gets brought up at almost every MLI discussion, or at least I bring it up, is the fact that we actually have to ask the other side what they need and what they want. What matters in a boardroom in Ottawa to 20 or 30 people and makes everybody happy isn't necessarily what is needed in Cambodia or in Bangladesh or in Malawi. We need to actually have those discussions with potential partners on what are the things that they need, and then bring that back to what our interests are, what we're good at, and what we're strong. So I think you've brought up, obviously you've stimulated some thoughts for me, but I think you've probably stimulated some thoughts for the audience too. So Balkan, I'm going to move over to you. I think most people in the room know Balkan. Obviously my partner in crime running the foreign policy program, and Balkan's been everywhere the last couple of years with Russia's war in Ukraine, and actually will be having to extricate himself a little bit early today, so you won't have a chance to fire too many questions at him, because he's going to Parliament to see President Zelensky's remarks later today. But Balkan, I wanted to bring you into this discussion and some of the different elements that have been discussed today. We've talked a lot about, and we've written papers, obviously, on how Canada, as I talked about in my framing remarks, has this multilateral frame that it puts on everything. We've talked about the need to think a little bit more creatively. It's not that we're going to remove ourselves from the United Nations or say that there's no chance of any reform, but clearly the geopolitical landscape, whether it's in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's in the Transatlantic, where you focus most of your energies, is shifting and has shifted beyond the comfort zone of where Canada is. So I wonder if you can give some initial framing remarks on your thoughts on this, and then we'll sort of bring it into a broader discussion.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And it will be a hard job to follow both Norbert and Renée here. So I'll try to limit my comments to a broader perspective, in the sense that how we need to think more thoroughly about the integration of diplomacy, defense, and development as a tool of statecraft. And if there is one sort of phrase that I want to come back and again in this, is that we need to think intention over convention, right? We need to be much more intentional about our engagement rather than blindly following the convention, because that's how we used to do things for 30 years, and now we continue to do that because path dependence, right? So we have to be much more intentional in our engagement. And I think there are a couple levels to think about this particular intention. One is the nature of the changing international system, which means that there is little buffer for countries like Canada to make mistakes. When things were relatively stable, international order is largely in our favor, we could afford to make mistakes and recover from them relatively quickly. The big brother is down there, we'll take care of things, we're broadly aligned, international system is in our favor, we're at the most important tables that shape the stuff. We could be missteps here and a wrong turn there. That did change, right? That changed. If we start continue to think either defense, diplomacy, or development as if we're partying in 1993, well, that's not going to work out anymore, right? The buffer, the margin of error decreased significantly. One of the reasons is that, of course, the whole idea of strategy is limited resources and ends. We need to be able to match the resources we have to the ends we want to pursue. That, again, brings back the notion of intention. What are we trying to achieve? What the goals are? And that requires, in a combination sense, a broad rethinking of Canadian foreign policy. When was the last time Canada had a big foreign policy review? What do we want in the world? Who do we want to engage with? Why are we engaging? Process itself is not the aim or should not be the goal. Talking is fine, but yes, Churchill was right. Georgia was better than war, but talking is supposed to serve a particular goal. If you don't know where you want to go, if you are not clear about the goals you would like to achieve, you will be like a headless chicken everywhere, right? On all the stables, and you're sitting there. Why are you sitting there? What are the metrics? Why are you, spending resources, and what are you getting back? Right? That all requires a broad understanding, a broad reframing of what the foreign policy interests of Canada are. How do we pursue them? What are the niche areas that Canada can leverage its capabilities, be it energy, be it food, be it our ability on high tech, particularly in AI, space technologies, etc. How can we leverage those capabilities to advance not only on the Canadian national interest, but at the same time help contribute elevating the well-being of the most vulnerable in the world? If you distribute everything everywhere, you're not going to achieve anything. And you need to start with that big foreign policy thing, then underneath, ideally, you'll have a national security review, and then you can get down to defense and specifics and development, et cetera, et cetera. But again, need to be intentional in engaging with the world and choose where we are focusing our energies and why. And if there are tables, institutions, or organizations that we are part of and are not serving their purpose, we should get up and move on and focus on the things that could make a difference. And I think the second level here is what both Norbert and Renée highlighted and Jonathan mentioned, engaging with civil society, with diaspora communities, with private sector in reaching to those partners and working with them and think them as partners rather than we are handing out charity. That is not only condescending, that is also not effective, right? One of the reasons of just thinking, yes, government to government aid and relations are important and all that kind of thing, but it is not sufficient to be able to achieve what we want to achieve, right? One of the primary reasons, there are two reasons, but one of the primary reasons is that we cannot compete in what is called the global south, which is a terrible term, but concepts die hard, so we stuck with that. But one of the reasons that we cannot compete with China in providing unlimited amounts without any strings attached and engaging in elite capture around the world. And this is not only a problem in the global south. I mean, we should look at the West as well, right? It's China and Russia, where the oligarchs, where the corruption money is being laundered. London, where does it go through real estate, Canada, other places. So elite capture is a fact of life by authoritarian adversaries around the world, including the West. But also, it's an area which we cannot or we should not also try to outcompete the Chinese of, okay, if they're giving you $1 billion no strings attached, we're going to give you $2 billion no strings attached. That's not going to be serving the people there. Now, what will be much more influential and important is to engage with the the people, with the companies, with the NGOs that understand the problem there. Going back to Jonathan's comment, listen to what people are needing and respond to that rather than come with a list of things that first do this and then we will give you money. That is not going to work. A great example, and I'm going to switch to my last comment in a minute. A great example of this is something I heard last March in a meeting in Rome, where the topic was the impact of Russia's war in Ukraine on North Africa and Sahel, and how that has an impact. And there were a lot of people, a lot of participants coming from North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. And one entrepreneur coming from Nigeria had a great example. He was part of about 100 or so people from West Africa and other parts of Africa that the Estonian government provided a fellowship. They went to Estonia, provided skills, seed money for building a company, built the networks, and then some of them, and including this guy, established a company headquartered in Tallinn, in Estonia, but operating and employing people in Nigeria. And in 2 years, he is making $100 million revenue. He's paying taxes in Estonia. He's providing resources, skills, and employment back home. And this is, development aid. It does not have to be, here is $500 million, go do what you want to do, right? So we need to be thinking much more innovatively. We need to be thinking much more actively and talking with the partners over there. And the last thing I want to sort of highlight is going back to the multilateralism issue. Being in every table just for the sake of being in every table is not foreign policy, right? Likewise, governance by announcement is not foreign policy. You need to be able to put the resources behind it and follow through. And in that sense, I don't necessarily see much difference between values and interests. I always maintain that interests are downstream from values, right? What are your interests? Including territorial integrity and sovereignty and political independence are fundamentally values. You value your ability to chart your own way and your public's will in the world without interference. That is a value. If someone tells you that, okay, everybody will get 100K a year, but you will have no right to determine who rules you, everything will be fine, but you will have no right to do so. If you're not going to choose that, that is a value, right? It is not necessarily pure interest. The important thing is that we need to be able to resource our words properly. Just empty talk will not necessarily bring any friends or reach results. So we have to be intentional in our engagement with the world, where we engage, who we engage with, and how we engage with, knowing what our goals are, how we want to achieve it, and move on when things do not happen, right? Just because we have been in the same table for 20 years does not mean that we need to be there, right? We need to have results, and we need to be results-focused rather than process-focused.
Thanks, Balkan. Always hard-hitting and frank, as I always expect from you, and I, full-throated agreement on most of the things you said. Intentional, I think, is a really good way to frame it. I mean, I often think of Canada as we're navigating a ship in waters without a compass, letting the waves sort of take us where they take us, and that's worked out okay for us for several decades, obviously because of our geography. Even though sometimes there's some challenges, I think we're in a very, very fortunate neighborhood with a very fortunate neighbor, and that's afforded us some ability to be complacent. But clearly those times are shifting and those times are changing, and it's not okay anymore to just be on a ship without a compass. A couple of comments. I agree with your intentional point. And so I want to break this into a bit of a discussion now and bring everyone back into it. But Balkan, I want to go back to you first quickly on something. So a couple things that struck out at me. First is this innovation idea that you mentioned, because I think not only do we need to be innovative and creative with the way we do our partnerships from a track one government to government perspective. So we talked about multilateralism, but I also think in a private sector sense. So, and Renée, it would be interesting to have your thoughts on this in defense too, because I think this is not just a diplomacy thing, but it's not just about government engaging with other development agencies or having partnerships on the ground, but actually involving our private sector a lot more. And this is something that we've seen other partners do, and I don't think that we've done as much of a good job on this. So I wonder if you could talk a bit about the private sector role. And second, and this is a big question which you guys will have more time to prep for, but getting back to the multilateralism side of it, clearly we see the inequities and the challenges, but what about the reform piece? So I won't give you the big question about the Security Council because we have no answers for that. But when thinking about development and thinking about the roles going forward, clearly multilateralism has some role. We're not saying it has zero role, but there's inherent flaws in many of the institutions, including the United Nations. How do we complement or sort of marry a much better, much more realistic, much more pragmatic multilateralism alongside the minilateral piece? And I guess my last point on this would be that, and I think it sort of came out of your comments and some of the comments from Renée and Norbert too, that was even within this minilateral piece, I think one of the things that is important always for states to engage in is the actual bilateral relationships. So we tend to forget this. We definitely forget this in the multilateral context, but there's a tendency even when thinking in regions that we forget, one region that I've focused a lot of attention on is the Indo-Pacific, for example. It's great that we're focusing on the Indo-Pacific, even though it might be challenged with recent events. But within that region is a massive amount of countries, a massive amount of different interests. We can never forget about trying to nurture individual bilateral relationships. So, Balkan, if I can kind of go back to you first, and then I'm going to go back this way to Renée and Norbert.
Sure. I think your question about how to balance multilateral versus unilateral versus bilateral set up what is a $64,000 question, or with inflation more like $64 million question to figure it out. But I think the key, again, going back to I don't want to sound like the parrot saying the same thing, but we need to know what our interests are, right? And it is part of the statecraft. We need to think foreign aid, development, diplomacy, security engagements is a part of the package of how Canadian statecraft is employed abroad for the benefit of Canadians, but also for the benefit of our partners and allies first, right? So that, I think, requires a good assessment of the existing structures, where we are benefiting and providing value, where we are basically just hanging around because everyone was hanging around there, and that's the habit, and where we need to build new things, right? And that requires, again, a good audit. Norbert is saying that he's going through audit. I think we need to have a good audit of those partnerships and multilateral and unilateral relationships in order to identify, this is our resources, this is what we can do, this is our interests, right? And how can we link this to the existing institutions? Do they work? Do they need to be reformed? Do we need to push back on the way that they are trying to be subverted, right? This is not a call for abandoning the UN system and whatnot. It is actually the reverse. It is being intentional in our engagement in the UN, just not sleepwalking, for example, as actors like China undermine and subvert and put people in the most boring comedies that shapes the regulations and norms moving forward. So 5 years down the road, we suddenly have internet-related or information-related regulation that is shaped by Beijing, right? We need to be able to coordinate with our allies. So there is unilateralism within multilateral settings too. We need to be able to work with our allies and partners in these big multilateral organizations in order to be able to push back against other states. Identify the areas where we have interest and can contribute, and trying to figure out what the bilateral leg of that is. And that requires, again, an intentional engagement with the Canadian interests. And of course, there's a period at which we didn't really talk about, and that is going back and talking this to the Canadians, right? It is we are a democracy. We need to be able to explain and convince that our people that this is serving their interests. And as a trading nation, as a nation that heavily relies on a stable, well-functioning, prosperous international system, Canada has a clear national interest in lifting up other places that will provide markets, that will provide resources, that will provide sources for immigration, talent, other places. It is in the Canadian national interest to engage in these particular ways, and we need to be able to tell this to the Canadian people. But in order to do that, we need to be able to show results, and that requires, again, an intentional involvement, showing that we are doing this for this particular purpose, these are the results we are getting, and that's why the Canadian taxpayer should be spending this money on.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Renée, I'm going to turn to you, but just quickly on Balkan's point, and MLI has done good polling work on this and good discussions on this as well, where how do we make foreign affairs issues, and I mean, thank you everyone for coming, so clearly you have interest in it, but how do we make these issues relatable and shown that they're a critical interest to Canadians? Because often we're missing this connective tissue. We're missing this connective tissue. We see it in elections. We see, I mean, was it the last election where we had one question? There was no foreign policy debate at all, but there was one question on foreign policy. So how do we make this relevant? I mean, it's one of these chicken and egg things on the foreign policy strategy. I mean, you could argue if you had an articulate foreign policy strategy that was intentional, that showed your interests, that maybe might spur Canadians. But we've seen consistently from some of the polling work that we've done that there is a demand signal. Canadians are not oblivious to this. They understand, whether it's Russia's war in Ukraine, whether it's some of the challenges that we've had, especially in the relationship with China, whether it's other global issues, obviously the pandemic that we had. They are interested and understand that international dimensions are core to what, for their domestic and day-to-day life. So how do we push this forward, I think is an important point. But Renée, feel free to comment on that, but also on the multilateral piece. I'd be interested in your perspective here on the reform side of it. And finally, as someone, I'm going to pick on you because you've served in government and you understand the realities of policymakers and budgets. How do we, with essentially not only limited money, but probably less money, how do we engage more nimbly? We're talking about these, all of these things as if we have an endless purse. But we understand there's probably not much more money coming to development. Maybe there's less. We all hope, so I'm not going to say there's not more money coming to defense, but we all hope there is, but there might not be in the near future. So how do we fulfill these sort of objectives with a very limited resource budget?
So this is a little bit cynical, but part of the multilateralism question is connected with the resource question. From a political standpoint, there is a hearkening to multilateralism to invoke a sentimentality, I think, from Canadians, because it's part of our identity that we are multilateral in nature. The political level sometimes deliberately provokes that sentimentality because multilateralism, from a resource perspective, also tends to provide cover for a limited liability approach. In other words, we might not be the last people holding the bag when the mission ends. And we saw this play out in Afghanistan directly. We had very smart people say, well, we weren't the ones that were there last, as though that is a reason why we have cover for not having the results that we had professed to being able to achieve early on. I think that was part of the collapse of the mission, was the fact that there wasn't a sober telling of the reality of the circumstance. So it's connected in a very cynical way. I remember, and Raquel might have been at this particular NATO meeting at the time, and sort of without breaking my oath, I remember the first NATO meeting after September 11th, and Donald Rumsfeld, there was clear tension in the hallway between Donald Trump and the Secretary General, Lord Robertson, at the time. And Rumsfeld was late because it was even questionable whether or not the Americans would need Article 5 to act. But speaking of sort of a limiting liability, there is a clear, very positive aspect to multilateralism that does provide that reassurance that there's not going to be a runaway train. Every NATO member in the NAC was was supportive of Article 5 being, it was unanimous, I believe, and everybody wanted it to happen, partly, and the Americans, you kind of got the sense from Rumsfeld, you know, sort of in his press conferences and everything else, that they could have had it or not, but they were still acting, and then that was sort of reconfirmed by the president repeatedly that we're going to go, you're either with us or you're not. But we certainly wanted Article 5 because we needed the cover that multilateralism intends to provide. So there's positive, you know, aspects of it, but there's also negative in the sense that it tends to be used as a bit of a cover. And sometimes, you know, it goes back to what Balkan said, and I mentioned this last time. I'm a bit of on this point, it's a bit of a pet peeve, but announcing things that you're not going to do is the opposite of building trust with your allies. And I always go back to the quick response force that we announced that we would have in our return to peace support ops. We never fielded that. We presented it to the machinery of the United Nations, and when we didn't field that QRF as in support of peace support ops, that's 200, but it's boots on the ground, so there's risk connected to it. When we didn't field it, more concerning was the collective shrug from our allies. Nobody, we were demarched, as I said last time we talked about this, we were demarched by the Americans, but otherwise, everybody just kind of said, we didn't really expect you to do it anyway. That is deeply concerning to me. So I think that the Venn diagram between what you say you're going to do and then what you do has increasingly not touched. And there's a bit of a stating the obvious approach. So, example, last budget, many were expecting funding for development. I still say CETA, it's a Freudian wish. Many people expected funding because of the commitment to sort of feminist foreign policy and specifically some of the work that was connected with gender inclusion abroad. And the budget reconfirmed the announcement that we're going to do gender inclusion and development, I want to say ops, but development work. In the budget, 2023, a repeat of the commitment, and then no line item attached to it. In other words, they're just restating the commitment without the execution, and very much doing it repeatedly. Now, people outside politics say, well, of course, that's politics. It's actually not. Increasingly, governments are getting comfortable blatantly repeating the commitment without the execution side. And I think part of that is because media have less resources to hold government to account. That would have been a story in budgets previous. It was only a story this time because some groups tried to make it a story. So, I think the accountability factor's a real one. Yeah. And what was your third question? There was.
Well, we'll park it for now, but you've ably handled that. Balkan, I'm going to give you a reprieve to go. Your good excuse to see the Ukrainian president. So you'll have to handle Balkan's questions too when it comes to question time. And we will get to the audience.
I get to run away from the questions.
Okay. So we will get to the audience, but Norbert, I do want to return to you. You've just heard some passionate and sometimes cantankerous Canadians that we are talking about this issue, about all the challenges in our foreign policy. I think, some of the words that come out to me, Balkan mentioned sleepwalking. I talked about a lack of a compass. Effectively, we're talking about diplomacy to be effective has to have moorings, whether it's interests, whether it's stated objectives, foreign policy, and that's something that we lack. I wanted to get your perspective from a German side as well, because things have been shifted. The ground literally under your feet has been shifting quite significantly over the past couple of years. Some of the topics that we've been talking about, whether it's multilateral reform, whether it's reshaping our foreign policy, what sort of lessons do you think Germany can give us, or some of the discussions that you've been having and some of your colleagues have been having over the last 16 months that might give us a little bit of inspiration? Not to say that you have it perfect. I know that there's challenges at home for you as well, but at least through your lessons learned, maybe there might be some ideas.
How much time do I have? If you allow me, I'd like to start from a more general perspective.
Sure.
Because my experience comes from the non-governmental sector. KS is a non-governmental organization receiving its funds from the German parliament, but nevertheless a non-governmental organization. People like us in development cooperation look at multilateral organizations normally with suspicion and skepticism because they come with a huge bureaucracy. And I've seen that. For example, I've served in Indonesia from 2002 to 2006, and a German official development cooperation represented by GIZ, the government-owned company who implements development policy, was there with 160 expatriates, sitting in a big high-rise together with Deutsche Bank, interestingly, yeah, behind a mirror facade. And that was the way they operated. What I want to say, Eisenhower famously introduced the American people to the military-industrial complex in his farewell speech in 1961. There's also a development complex we have to be aware of, which in my country alone employs around 16,000 people, bigger than many stock-listed companies. And it has its own inner life. It has its own character. And it comes with a considerable portion of vanity. Meaning, I want to see my flag on top of a successful project, not yours, even if you're my friend. Yeah? And a lot of things are done to achieve exactly that. As I said, I was in Indonesia during the time when the tsunami happened on December 26, 2004, which was a Sunday afternoon, which I will never forget because I was on the bowling alley and I got a call from Germany, are you still alive? And I was wondering why. Turns out we in Jakarta didn't know anything what was happening in Aceh. So over the night we were all becoming more aware what was happened, and on Monday morning we got a call from the World Bank whose director offered that all the international organizations would have a coordination meeting daily from then on every morning, 7:30 at their office, in order to think how can we help Indonesia. And what happened in the first 10 days, believe me or not, was nothing more than country A, we have 10 million. Country B, we have 20 million. Country C, we have 30. That went on for 2 weeks, as far as I remember, for one reason, because none of us had any contacts in Aceh. We were never prepared to go there. We just didn't know what to do, how to get there, and what the people needed, because there was no telecommunication, and we didn't know what was going on there. But what struck me was that nobody came up with a practical idea. So like, what if there is a tsunami, what would people need first? Yeah, some ideas were not presented until the third week. Yeah? And finally, something happened in the third week. Yeah? But then, of course, you had these phenomena, which you will know, that on every package there's a little sticker, a gift from the people of X and a gift from the people of Z. Yeah? And I'm so grateful my country never did that. Yeah? My country, however, on the webpage of the ministry BMZ, in Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, in charge of running development policy, you will say every euro we spend generates 2.5 euro in orders from the respective countries. That's a very, very straightforward answer to the question of many people, which politicians face. And I was a political operative before I joined CAS 26 years ago, with around 600 campaign events under my belt. And no matter where you're canvassing, in front of the factory door, 6 a.m. in the morning, or in front of the supermarket, whether the economy is good and bad, after 5 minutes, people are asking you, why do we have to send so much money abroad? Yeah, that's the usual question. And they are not altogether wrong, because development cooperation is normally the file with the biggest waste in government. Yeah? The only thing is people don't know about it. Would they know, they would probably storm the ministry and burn it down. That was my theory in Germany. Because I also happened to serve as a director of evaluation of KS for 5 years. And you see into the inner workings of your own organization, and you are happy if you have 25% of successful projects according to the goals which you yourself have defined. Yeah? 25% are going out so, and 50% are, yeah. And it's also an area where there's a different form of truth. I don't want to say lie. There's a major player in our country, many people know, providing financial means for the development project. And once a year they present in their bombastic headquarters in Berlin. They have a big press conference, they present the results of development cooperation, and they have a unique system of school grades, how to evaluate their project success. 1 is the best, 6 means failed. 1 to 3 means successful projects, 4 to 6 means failed. And a board member himself presents the results, and then you see, you wonder, what makes the difference between a successful project and a failed project? Why do you give here a 3? Why do you give a 4 there? And the interesting thing is that it's never the organization itself, it's always 2 external factors, namely the unqualified local partners or the political framework conditions, which we cannot influence. Yeah? So they regularly let themselves off the hook. Yeah? That's also a big problem. What Balkan also said, we need to speak to the people what they want. That refers to the OECD principle of ownership, which the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD has been promoting for decades. It's a good thing, of course. It means practically, as was said, we talk to our partners first, what do you need, and then we design our program accordingly. The problem with that is you have 2 kinds of partners. There are partners abroad who couldn't care less about ownership. They just let you come and say, whatever you give us, we are happy about everything. Or the other variety is they have very specific requests which you do not want to fulfill, such as, for example, budget support. Don't come here with development projects. Just pump some billions in our state budget and we will do what we think is best, which is, of course, not acceptable to many stakeholders in our country. Yeah? And that stands between what our ideals and their ideals, and therefore makes success very, very difficult. Yeah. Overall, the best recipe for successful projects is, or for a successful policy over long term, in my experience, is just be there. Yeah. Be a good friend, be a reliable partner. I'm saying this because I have observed countries with lots of budget and lots of potential to give to the local partners. They go in for 2 years, then they go out. I don't know, I don't understand why. A small organization like KAS, we are normally appreciated by our partners because we do not have much budget, but we normally stay in the country, and I refer to your entrance statement, for many, many years. So we are always there, and they know they can come to us even with very difficult projects and problems, and we try to find a solution. Yeah? But then development cooperation is the classic area where I have seen poverty alleviation, income generation, federalism, decentralization, sustainability, and in Germany we have a nice idiom. We say, every time we do something new, we say we chase a new sow through the village. Yeah? And this happens every other year now. It's feminist foreign policy. Yeah? And in 2 or 3 years, there will be something else. Yeah, I know. But the development complex needs that in order to keep itself alive. That's also sure. Yeah? Whether we would make, when we would make an, if we would make if we made an honest evaluation in our target countries, what we really achieved, the results would probably be sobering. But then, as director of evaluation, I learned if you don't want to get these answers, don't conduct evaluations. Yeah, yeah. It's very human. The whole area is very human. The most successful instrument I have come across is individual support, especially in countries where we can't work politically. Belarus is such a country. We cannot have an office there due to the political circumstances. So what we do is to get young people out there, train them, educate them, and the best results we have achieved over time is with individual support. Those are success stories, people who have the knowledge, who have a concrete idea what they want to do with it. They later on become human rights defenders. They build up startups, they build up educational organizations. And normally they come back to us and say, this would not have been possible if you didn't open me the pathway to educate myself. Yeah. And that's what I would do if I had a chance. I would focus more on programs of individual support instead of throwing money into big organizations and networks, especially civil services around the world, where you cannot really control what comes out, because also the objectives we formulate sometimes are a little bit abstract. Of course, they are broadly formulated in order to make impact control easier. But then, of course, if you look at the project at 10 years, after you leave, what is there? Sometimes you will not find anything anymore. We call this a development ruin. Yeah, and there are more of this than you can imagine. Yeah? So if Canada wants to engage, I recommend a targeted approach. Don't go everywhere. Pick countries where you have people you come along with very well, where you have experience and personal relations which can carry all this, and then you will be most successful.
If I can respond to that, I'm struck listening to the discussion of bureaucracy out of control, white elephant, the end result being white elephant projects around the world because we haven't gone in at the right level. We've gone in at the national level, or not listened to what the need was. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of the day, that China doesn't have to do any of that. The thing that they're good at is marshaling resources across sectors in China in a unified way. And they are able to do that because they dictate it. And from a liberal democracy perspective, we have to contend with governance issues. We have to contend with burgeoning bureaucracies where interests at the political level mix with interests at the civil service level, and then you have the development industrial complex added to that. How do we match our presence in the world in a way that challenges the China creep when we have such challenges as it relates to our home, and frankly, that's the challenge of a liberal democracy, obviously, and we've all had those lessons learned. I mean, in Afghanistan, we learned very quickly that the fastest way to get a school blown up is to put a Canadian flag on it, and people will die. So the traditional take credit for something by putting your flag on it, we learned in a very difficult way how damaging that can be. So it's a challenge for sure.
I think well, thank you both for those great points. I did want to open it up now to the audience. I mean, there's a lot that's been said already, a lot that probably still can be said. But I wanted to give the audience a chance, just a few, not many ground rules, but just when you do raise your hand, please identify your name and your affiliation. And if it's for the panel generally, that's okay, or if it's directed towards one of either Norbert or Renée. Balkan has taken leave, so he can't answer questions in absentia. So please feel free to consider the floor open. Otherwise, I'm going to give you tough questions about the UN. Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Sandrine Perrion. I am with Strategist Consulting, a public affairs and development company, which I created 5 years ago. And I also come from social international development with the government of Canada, and also happen to have been raised in Europe and chose Canada as my country. So I'd like to speak with respect to 3 things. You did mention about having a compass in order to navigate through the waters right now, and I would say that maybe more than a compass, what we need is an actual vision. So in that respect, don't we need to reconsider the public management tools with regards to the result-based management? Because what I'm noticing is that when we driving programs, and I totally agree with Mr.
Eschborn?
Yes, absolutely, Robert, Dr. Robert about the fact that I would summarize it like that social development needs to be replaced. People needs to be the human. We need to see things from the human perspective, because when we deal with social development, we talk about foreign aid, but it's more about people, and it's to be able to put people at the center, and more than indicators, because we become so focused on results that we tend to forget exactly the goal and the reason why we are on the field that we go and on those in this particular country. So this is just for, I'd like to hear your perspective with regards to that. And with regards to multilateralism, excuse my French, I am French origin. So I'd like to mention that multilateralism versus maybe a multidisciplinary approach to international development. Don't we need to consider that as well? Because it's not only to bring, to be the savior and to go there with as Superman, but to be able to do things with people, and that the interest should be really to leave those countries or the people that we are looking to help, to look at them as partners and as fellows, rather than people that we are trying to help. So if we do that, everything will be short term. But if we think on the long run, and if we think about accompanying them in order to alleviate their conditions, I guess the perspective would be much different. So this is what I wanted to really speak in regard with, and I'd like to hear your perspective with regards to that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the question. Do we have any additional questions? If I can grab another one as well. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Ben. I work in defense. And my question circles around one of the topics is lying underneath this conversation. We've talked about investment of funds in a range of different activities, being more clear and efficient with our resources. But it appears that there's a more kind of immediate question about whether or not the current best foreign policy is a strong domestic policy. We're facing inflation issues, sluggish growth. United Auto Workers just striked in America, and that's certainly going to have trickle-ons here. And is this a better juncture to spend our energy and resources investing in our domestic policy and growth, acknowledging that the crowning achievement of the Cold War was that the Western Bloc built an economy that was just unmatchable. And even in Russia right now, Russia's at war with a $1.3 trillion economy against a $40 trillion combined economy of Europe and North America. Is that a better foreign policy than spending a lot of time investing money abroad?
You're at defense. It's a great question, and particularly, if I may.
Yeah, sure.
Particularly, prescient right now. In a sort of, I'll answer yours first, and then definitely speak to yours. Obviously, there is tension always between the domestic and international. And as Jonathan said, the numbers that are sourced from public polling companies, as well as the proprietary political number, the partisan numbers that are done, always bear out the same thing. And it kind of harkens back to what Dr. Eschborn experiences, which is like, why are we spending our money abroad? Why can't we invest it here? Right now, that tension is as high as I can imagine it to be. And the government, has read the tea leaves and, has clearly gone, we don't know what's going to come out with the DPU, but dental over defense. There's an announcement of spending and investing on Canadians. And so, that tension in the face of, we were trying to hit 2% inflation, we're at 4%, it's growing. Yesterday at the Bank of Canada, so it's going to only get worse. So it's a good point, and it kind of comes back to the inevitability that we still have to protect and maintain our sovereignty in the face of an increasingly unpredictable world. And I'll just tell a quick war story on this. On September 11th, this is in the public domain, so I can speak to it, but on September 11th, I was in the Minister of Defense's office. And, it was a terrible day, 3 or 4 a.m. on September 12th. It was basically the same day, in my mind, because I hadn't slept and we were flat out working. Everybody sort of gathers into the JSAT to talk about what we know now. And the Prime Minister, undisclosed location, is mic'd into the JSAT, and he asks, do we know who did this? And his NSIA at the time, not called an NSIA, I forget what she was called, but she said, if it is this she said his name wrong, if it is this Osama bin Laden, we've known about this festering situation for quite some time. And I'm a kid. I'm at the time 25. I'm in the secondary seats that you're probably familiar with, I'm not quite at the table. And I could not believe that I was hearing that the entire world knew about that and nobody did anything. And, the question of resources becomes very moot at that point, and economies become very moot at that point. And, I think the fact that she got his name wrong was an indicator that we knew, but we weren't paying real attention to it. And what we know for sure is that the next war always looks different than the last. So you kind of have to, in a period where you have to procure things, hedge your bets over the long term, and that necessarily means predictable, sustainable funding. And it means what you were talking about, as I believe, with development too, a vision. It means people talking about it and deciding where they're going to invest. We made a great investment with the labs in the late 1990s because we had not enough money. We needed to procure vehicles. We had put our money on light, up-armored, fast vehicles. The Americans were buying tanks. They were buying, what we called in Afghanistan grave makers because they were not able to be up-armored and they weren't fast and light. They eventually went to the LAV. The reason those decisions were so good is because partly we had niche spending ability. And so I think we've lost the appreciation for that to start with. But I also think a vision is absolutely required now. And having been part of the SSE, this Strong, Secure, Engaged policy, I'm very proud of that document. I don't know what's going to come out with the DPU, but that was an all hands on deck exercise. Like every 3 or 4 times a week, including Sundays, we were in conference room B writing that document. A real vision. It was well socialized across the country, and it came out. When it came out, it was really clear that we needed a foreign policy to embed it in, and we didn't have one. We had, we had Chrystia Freeland stand up in the House 2 days before the defense policy was released and said, here's our foreign policy. Now, there's been books written about the fact that Canada typically establishes foreign and development policy in that way, and defense tends to go the kind of white paper route. But I think there is serious merit to what you're saying as it relates to foreign policy being a requirement, development having a more visual role. And speaking of visual role, I'll end on this. Not to romanticize it at all, but because there were definitely problems, and the problems stem from that sort of not being real partners. That aside, Jean Chrétien, when he was Prime Minister, never traveled abroad without seeing a CETA project. Every time he traveled, he took all of the cameras that went with him on a prime ministerial trip, and usually the last item he did was go to a CETA project somewhere in the world. And what he was doing was very much what you're talking about, looking at individuals and saying, these are the people where your money, Canada, is going. And that had a really positive impact on Canadians' appreciation, I believe, for the effort and where it was going. Now, the downside was that it was fairly, there was that manifest destiny type, not real partners aspect to the project sometimes.
Thanks so much, Renee. Well, Norbert, we'll move over to you, but just very quickly before I do, just commenting on that question and your reflections, which I think were really great. I think one of the things, and we've talked about with Balkan's point about trying to understand foreign policy and why it's important to Canadians, is the idea that it's tempting to think, on one hand, that, of course, with the domestic situation much of us are facing on inflation and other issues, we should be putting our attention there. But there's a direct interconnection, clearly. We've seen this with Russia's war in Ukraine. We've seen this with economic crises from time to time, that these issues are intimately interconnected. And we may, for convenient reasons, want to feel that we can, we can live in a lap of luxury and not worry about these foreign policy challenges. But if we do not nurture them beforehand, they will come back to bite us. And one example I'll give you on this, we hope this scenario never takes place, but as a potential contingency in East Asia, for example, if we're not prepared from a national security, national defense perspective, and not just having the ships, not just having the resources to get our citizens out, which we have tens of thousands of citizens based not only in Taiwan, but in East Asia. If we don't have those resources ahead of time, in addition to the agreements that we need, this is a national security issue. This is a domestic issue. We're talking about Canadian citizens. So I think that it's important. I sympathize with the idea in many ways too that we do need to focus on many things at home, and I think we're not the only country thinking about that. Obviously, we have politicians across the G7 who are also thinking about the fact that we have domestic issues that we need to focus on. But what I would argue, and I think one of the roles that we're trying to keep the conversation going on, is that foreign policy, the idea that it's over here and foreign affairs issues are over here and we have domestic here, that world probably never existed, but clearly it doesn't exist in today's sort of globalized world. But Norbert, sorry to preempt you, your time.
Not at all. I have full understanding for you, sir, from the defense what you said, because I would like to say there's Harry Potter, there's Game of Thrones, and there's reality. And in the middle between all of them is the combined failure of people like Jonathan, of people who work in the media, and for people in politics. What failure I'm referring to? The failure to explain to the ordinary citizen what a threat perception is.
Yes, yes.
I mean, I would be very worried as a Canadian, and I wrote an article about that this year, about what is going on in the Arctic. All kinds of activities which you cannot be happy about as Canadians going on. Nobody does anything effective against it, and still they are ongoing. They have consequences for you, and they might even serve the preparation of something bigger. We have no idea. And as somebody who has represented Germany in North Korea, I can say you don't need to take drugs to experience a different reality. Just go to some countries and you have it. Yeah. And I mean, the fact that we cannot imagine that something happens in the Arctic doesn't mean it's not going to happen in our lifetime. And I would be very worried as a Canadian citizen that we don't have control about this. Yeah. And I was glad that at least one political party had now decided that if they come to power one day, they are building a military station in the Arctic there, and a port to at least base some soldiers there and some capacity to take back control. Yeah, I mean, I come from a country with a short coastline, can't imagine that, but we are as unprepared as you are, Navy-wise, for example, to take control. But the bigger issue is, why haven't media, politics, and academia not managed in both our countries to make the threat perception, which is clearly there, clear to the majority of our population? And
in addition to that, if I may, the fact is, as you've said, both of you have said perfectly, economic prosperity, the underpinning of economic prosperity is security and stability. There's no question that the inflation that we're seeing is as a result of international events. So there's a direct link between domestic economic health and, you know, the condition of the world and what's happening abroad. So, and I would agree that, you know, having been charged with that task of trying to make Canadians care, you see I get very exercised about the failure to be able to do that and repeatedly see that Canadians care, but only when something happens. The numbers spike.
Same with Germans.
Yeah, the numbers spike from 15th or 16th of concern on security and defense and foreign policy issues when Ukraine happens, or when a tsunami happens, or when, you know, in that space of that spike, a lot of things can happen. And one of the things I'm a little bit worried about is the hyper-polarization of politics, and how ideological politics and has resulted in less, frankly, it's almost like a post-truth world. So far, foreign defense and security policy, development policy, has been relatively unscathed by that hyper-partisan polarization. Most Canadians agree basically on our position on most things. There's not a lot of wedge issues to be had in in that sphere. One of the things that I saw this week that I was very heartened by was when the Prime Minister made the announcement in the House, the opposition leaders also spoke. Canadians, no matter what the issue is, no matter how you feel about the issue, one of the things that we do is bring it in with the communities. You know, all leaders from Harper to Chrétien to Martin have stepped forward in the House to ask for calm and to reassure communities in Canada when something like this happens. And, you know, I think it's really important because there could be, you know, it has the potential for real domestic strife right now. So having everybody come together is really important. The fact that we do that I find very heartening, and it shows that there's a beyond partisan appreciation for these issues. It lasted about 24 hours, so it tends to have time sensitivity, but so far people don't, on the floor of the House, make political wedge issues out of foreign and defense policy, partly because they make terrible wedge issues, because Canadians tend to agree on them. But
Okay. Well, I fully agree. Norbert, did you have any last comments before we?
Yeah, I think your question, we should try at least to give a satisfactory answer. As I said, my experience over years is that the individually focused support yields best results because it helps to create a kind of personality in our target countries, which can individually, independently create new opportunities for their own people. Yeah, because what helps normally best is if they have a model they can look to. Yeah, I mean, look at Mr. Yunus Bank, which we had in South Asia. How many people have tried to copy that? Yeah, and provide loans to women and other groups of society who never would get a loan from a regular bank. Yeah, and how successful this has been, and how often it has been copied over the world. Yeah, and I could think of many examples. Yeah, but I like what you said. Go away from indicators. Yeah, I had terrible fights with our ministry about indicators as success proofs of our development projects. Yeah, because people who like these indicators are normally technical thinkers. Yeah, but in the area of human development, there are no technical indicators. Yeah, we cannot just say because of 100 people we gave scholarships, 80 could gain a degree. The other 20 maybe failed, but they might have been successful in building up something else because they just didn't like to go to school. Yeah, and we have many examples of people who made quite some careers without having a school degree. Yeah, to say it very simply.
Okay, well,
if I could just add to that, this indicators question is clearly why Chrétien was more successful than we've been to date on communicating why your money should go to countries abroad. Because we've been relying on indicators which don't make the case. Typically their home countries are the ones communicating or developing those indicators. The mathematicians and in defense there's a concept, the McNamara effect, that in Vietnam obviously McNamara would go up and give we're winning this war because here are the numbers, and so defense has kind of learned the hard way that does not communicate the status of an endeavor, especially in conflict zones. I don't know if there's an equivalent McNamara effect along development lines, but it certainly is it's the same case that indicators do not work.
Well, thank you. And I know their stomachs are growling, and I have to give the floor back to Idee, but this has been a really great discussion. And Norbert, I may take both of your points. I think they were excellent additional insights and great questions from the audience. And I think your point that we all need to step up our game. By no means are we here. It's easy from the outside to hector and to lecture, but I think that you're right. I think whether it's on the political side, whether it's in the bureaucratic side, whether it's in the media, whether it's in think tanks, academia, I think we all need to not just communicate to Canadians, but I think communicate with Canadians, and I think that's something as an institute that we like to do, is actually have that as an ongoing discourse and discussion. Everyone has interests and stakes in foreign affairs and foreign policy issues. It's not just a cabal of a few people in Ottawa. So I think that we'll continue this discussion. The good thing as well is that it won't just be this discussion for the 30 or 40 that have been here, but also this will be on YouTube, and maybe that's not what the young people are watching nowadays, so we'll have to innovate, and we won't do TikTok. We're not a TikTok place here at MLI, but we will have to think about other mediums as well. But thank you so much to the panel, and Idee, if I can pass the floor back to you to just close us off.
Well, listen, I thank you very much, and I think this has been a very engaging discussion. I mean, I am very, very glad we did it. And Norbert, I think we take your challenge and take up your challenge to say we need to do more of this, and we need to do more of this outside of MLI, I guess, so that people can understand the real value of what the crosswalk between domestic interest and international issues are. It's obviously very, very gracious to all of you for participating, and thank you everybody for coming. I did just want to acknowledge my colleague from the Wellington Advocacy, Christopher Greer, who is here with me. And this is not the end. This is just the beginning of a series of dialogues that we're going to have with MLI on this issue. So watch out for that. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. And please stay for food.
Get some food. Thank you.
Thank you.